From the Gulf States newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm community engagement reporter Elise Gregg, chopping it up this week. Redistricting has been seared into the headlines across the Gulf South lately, with Louisiana and Alabama both setting up new congressional maps. That all follows the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Louisiana versus Callais, which, in short, makes it significantly more difficult to challenge electoral maps as being racially discriminatory to minority voters. The conversations have centered largely on congressional redistricting, although other statewide maps are also a major consideration right now. For example, here in Mississippi, we may see new legislative and judicial maps in the coming months. But what gets lost in the mix are local maps, districts to elect officials like county supervisors or school board members. These positions often have a lot of immediate impact on their communities, and the maps used to elect those officials are subject to the same protections that statewide maps are under the Voting Rights Act. And local redistricting may very well be on the way, so I talked to local officials here in Mississippi about what's at stake and what that could mean for communities in the Gulf South. There's a lot happening in Louisiana and Alabama in getting new electoral maps right now. But between those two states, a lot's still up in the air for redistricting in Mississippi. What's certain, though, is that Governor Tate Reeves wants state lawmakers to have plans in place to redraw judicial, legislative, and congressional maps before elections in 2027. And those maps are important, but local leaders like Greenville Mayor Eric Simmons say fears around redistricting don't stop there.
This debate is about more than maps. It's about whether Black communities in Greenville throughout the Delta retain the ability to meaningfully shape decisions affecting their future, their economies, their schools, their healthcare systems, and their children.
Simmons is acutely familiar with the protections offered to local officials and local communities through the Voting Rights Act. At 49 years old, he's only the second Black mayor in the history of Greenville. And while some see redistricting moves as a win for race neutrality, Simmons says that's not what his constituents see.
And I can't underscore it too often in American history, the procedure was defended while the outcome devastated communities. The surgery was declared successful even while the patient suffered. And once again, here we are told it's not about race. For many Mississippians at the local level, that phrase no longer brings comfort, it brings that memories.
While the spotlight is on redistricting at the state and congressional levels, the local level might be the most devastated, particularly for majority Black cities and towns like Greenville, which, as of 2025, was roughly 80% Black. Jackson-based voting rights attorney Amir Badat, who's also the Southern States Director and Senior Advisor at Fair Fight Action, says that's crucial to remember. Just outside the Capitol building, he discussed how the local level is absolutely where the redistricting fight may play out over the next several years.
I think what you're going to see fairly soon is cities and counties moving quickly to try to redistrict those lines as well.
Basically, the U.S. Supreme Court made it harder to challenge electoral maps based on racial discrimination in the case Louisiana versus Callais. The same ability to challenge state electoral maps applies to local maps.
City councils, school boards, election commissions, boards of supervisors, all of those entities were subject to the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And that's actually why in Mississippi we have so many local Black elected officials, because the Voting Rights Act granted those protections to Black voters at the local level.
And that means representation on day-to-day issues like schools, roads, local health care, and more. Humphreys County Circuit Clerk and Registrar Marvin Jones also has concerns about what'll happen to local elections if local lines get redrawn. But Jones also sees everything playing out on the national and statewide stage in terms of what it'll do to his county, specifically if state lawmakers redraw the only majority Black district to get rid of Democratic Congressman Benny Thompson.
From a congressional level, it'll still change, because when we look at Congress that we have now, he does what he can to take care of Humphreys County or just the Delta period.
And even with representation from Mississippi's U.S. senators, Jones says it's Thompson who they trust to care for the region.
They represent us too, but we always have to turn to one congressman to take care of Humphreys County.
The threat of redistricting to Jones is a threat of representation with no ties to the voters in places like the Delta, who he says are often undermined by state leadership already.
When federal dollars, for example, are sent down to the state of Mississippi, and those dollars are turned away only because they don't want to disperse it into the poor parts of the state. And it's not only affecting just black people, it's affecting everybody.
And without that support at the highest level, Jones believes that resources will continue to be whittled down for the Delta, and local leaders will be left without the support they need to help their communities. For Jones, though, that doesn't stop with redistricting. It requires everybody in Mississippi, across the board, seeing the struggles of every community as an issue for the whole state. You're listening to the Gulf States Gumbo. I'm Elise Gregg, and those were local officials here in Mississippi on what losing protections from the Voting Rights Act could mean at the community level. I'm joined now by Greg LaRose from the Louisiana Illuminator to talk a little bit more about how local representation in New Orleans has been hit by these larger-scale political battles lately. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Elise, thanks for the invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Louisiana is where all of this redistricting stuff started, and following the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Louisiana versus Callais, the state redrew its congressional maps. But in New Orleans, there was some controversy with a local elected official around the same time. For a little bit of background for our listeners who may not be familiar with everything going on here, this was a gentleman who got elected to this criminal court position, and then his position just was consolidated with the civil courts, and it kind of turned into a bit of a legal mess for a while there, right?
Right. The person who won that race is really a very intriguing story on his own. Calvin Duncan was wrongfully convicted of a murder back in the early 80s and served nearly 3 decades at Angola before he was released through a plea to a lesser charge. And ultimately, it was discovered that the evidence brought against him was wrong. He was eventually exonerated, and after his release, he pursued a law degree and has been working ever since to help the formerly incarcerated and those who are wrongfully incarcerated. And he decided that he would run for the Orleans criminal clerk's post. He wins that race resoundingly back in November over the incumbent. And before he can take that office in May, the Louisiana legislature approves a law that eliminates the job he was about to take.
Gotcha. And so who ended up taking that? Was it someone else that got elected in, or what how did they manage to put a Band-Aid on that?
What legislators did was approve a law that consolidates the civil and criminal clerk's offices. So the seated clerk, Chelsea Napoleon, is now in charge of both courts. Originally, there was going to be a bill that eliminated the dual court system. That stayed intact, and Chelsea Napoleon is now in charge of both.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for clearing that up for us a little bit. It's a lot of loose wires there.
Yeah, you kind of need a roadmap to follow this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do feel like some of this stuff does get wrapped up in the court cases, though, in the bills, and generally just some of the legalese that doesn't always translate to the effects on communities in the real world. You know, for our listeners who aren't familiar with this setup in New Orleans, what does this consolidation and removal of the clerk position practically mean for people in the city?
Well, when it comes time for elections, you'll see fewer races on the ballot, for one thing, 3 fewer criminal court judgeships, and obviously now just one single court. But then I think it's a matter of just the logistics of the criminal court system. So New Orleans has had this dual court system going back to the late 1800s. Remember at that time, well, you mean, I don't think anyone listening will remember, but New Orleans at one time was like we think now of, say, Atlanta, Miami, Houston. It was the city of the South, and it had a huge caseload. And the powers that be at the time felt there was a need to split up the systems. And over time, it just stuck that way. And obviously, since Hurricane Katrina over the past 20 years, there's been a decline in population. And I think more of a will of lawmakers from other parts of the state to maybe right size the city's judicial system. And that's run into some resistance from elected officials here and those who would take, say, more of a progressive approach to criminal justice. And there's been the rub between conservative, tough on crime lawmakers that make up the bulk of the legislature and the delegation from here in New Orleans who sort of see this as kind of an attack on the city sovereignty, if you will, and that it happens alongside a generational U.S. Supreme Court decision with regards to Calais. New Orleans really was sort of in defense mode and not successful in that defense of trying to preserve the elected offices that it wanted to.
Gotcha. Here in Mississippi, with redistricting still kind of on the horizon, but not quite here yet, voters I've spoken with are really focusing on how to educate themselves, how to talk to their friends and family about voting, all stuff to really prepare for what's ahead with any redistricting, whether that's going to be local, statewide, or congressional. And I'm curious what you've seen in New Orleans and Louisiana generally from all the everyday folks who are in the middle of seeing their local representation cut back and diluted a little bit, kind of like you said, in defense mode, especially with this Calvin Duncan issue.
It's really been a lot of frustration with the Calais ruling effectively saying you cannot use race when drawing political districts. Obviously, a big call for people to participate in elections. We're in the midst of a congressional party primary right now. And in our mid-May elections, turnout was just 40%, which, doesn't really leave me personally with a feeling that people are all too energized to go up to the polls. But I think it's worth noting that voters did reject the slate of amendments that Governor Jeff Landry, a Republican, had back. So you're sort of sensing, especially here in New Orleans, this kind of cauldron bubbling, this discontent. I don't know that that necessarily reverses anytime soon what we are seeing happening with regards to redistricting, but I think it is getting the attention of Republican leaders who kind of recognize that, okay, well, maybe in some sort of fashion, sooner, maybe rather than later, there's a political price to pay.
Right. And kind of to continue touching on what's next here, the Louisiana Supreme Court has upheld the bill removing Duncan. And so do we have a sense of what's next, either in court or, again, like you said, there's some frustration in the community, but not so sure about the direction at this point?
New Orleans Mayor Helena Moreno has asked basically for a reconsideration from the court on that decision. I would be very surprised if that goes anywhere. Um, Another thing that the local criminal justice system has to deal with too is that the state, in addition to downsizing the courts, is pulling away money from the district attorney's office and spreading that around the state. So it's hard to say that there's really like something that can be done locally to counter that. I think what the New Orleans delegation in the legislature is trying to map out is a path forward, knowing that they are up against a governor in Baton Rouge who's very likely to win re-election, has great sway with a Republican supermajority in the legislature. I don't know necessarily that that's something that they can counter with some plan of their own, but it's, I guess, a matter of trying to figure out where they fit in the landscape that's ahead.
Greg, before we wrap, we do this thing called Gulf States Gems at the end of the show to highlight the people, places, and things that we love across the region. And I know today's episode is a little on the serious side, but I did want to see if you have any gems you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Well, of course, it's going to be food related. I'm in New Orleans, and I think when you mention New Orleans and food, po' boy is probably going to be part of that conversation, and hopefully taking you off the beaten path a little bit. C&A Seafood, the letter C and A. It's at the end of Norman C. Francis Parkway, where it meets Earhart. It's a Vietnamese American family. Just killer po' boys, killer boiled seafood, and all of your Vietnamese cuisine favorites. I'm there probably at least every other week.
Okay, I love Vietnamese food. I love po' boys, so that sounds like a dream come true for me, so I will have to check it out next time I'm in New Orleans. Alrighty.
Excellent. You'll enjoy.
Well, that was Greg LaRose with the Louisiana Illuminator. Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
This week's show is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Again, I'm your host, Elise Gregg. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your roux.